Gwynn adds, there was a tremendous battle going on in the vicinity of where we had come into the clearing and beyond there in the jungle. It was Charlie Company caught in the killing zone of the ambush, fighting for its life. The mortar fire had ceased. The enemy tubes apparently had been overrun by Charlie Company because we found them all the next day. But there were still hundreds of North Vietnamese calmly walking around the area we were observing. Now began the sniping phase of our battle. I call it that because for a long period of time, all we did was pick off enemy wandering around our perimeter, and this lasted until we started getting air support. Everything that had happened to this point had probably taken less than 30 minutes. Gwynn saw Major Frank Henry, the battalion executive officer, lying on his back using the radio, trying desperately to get some tactical air support, and succeeding. The air was on the way, but there was no artillery or aerial rocket artillery yet. Jim Spires, the S3, ran over to us and queried Gordy Grove as to the situation outside the perimeter where he had just come from. Grove told him there were still men out there, tightened into a small perimeter, but they were all wounded and dying, and the radios had all been knocked out. Captain Spires asked a second time if he thought anyone was still alive, and none of us said anything. Gwynn climbed atop a termite hill and began sniping at the North Vietnamese visible across the clearing in the trees to the south with his M16 rifle. There were plenty of targets, and I remember picking off 10 or 15 NVA from my position. My memories revolve around the way in which each enemy soldier fell that I hit. Some would simply slump limply to the ground. Some reacted as if they had been hit by a truck. Some that I missed on the first and second shots kept on milling around until I finally hit them. What we did not know at the time was that they were wandering around the elephant grass looking for Americans who were still alive and killing them off one by one. North Vietnamese soldiers climbed into trees and on top of those brush-covered termite hills and poured fire down on the cavalry troopers trapped in the tall grass below them in the main body of the column. There was serious firing, including mortar fire from both sides. The strike at the head of the column was followed so quickly by the enemy encircling assaults that the whole business seemed to erupt almost simultaneously. Without doubt, some platoons of McTade's battalion were alert and in as secure a formation as they could achieve in the elephant grass, brush, and thick scrub trees. But the visibility problem made it difficult to maintain formation, and one result was that American troops were closer to one another than was tactically sound, providing juicy targets for a grenade, mortar round, or a burst from AK-47 rifle. All down the column, platoon leaders, sergeants, radio operators, and riflemen by the dozens were killed or wounded in the first 10 minutes, rapidly degrading communication, cohesion, and control. So this whole thing that we've talked about up to this point was like a half an hour. Just a brutal onslaught that kicked off with massive violence of action. Captain Fesmeyer adds, the result was very intense, individual, hand-to-hand combat. In the confusion, I had no idea exactly where the company was located. When Lieutenant Cornett died, it was virtually impossible for me to talk to anyone in my company. The battle had clearly become an individual struggle for life. Again, that was the goal of the Vietnamese, was to make it an individual struggle, was to get in close, was to separate people from the main battalion, to split it up into as many parts as possible so they could pick it apart. Spec 4 Jack Smith, who was in Charlie Company, had been a radio operator until about a week or so before this operation when he was shifted to a supply clerk's job. The events of November 17 are etched on his mind. Smith's company commander, Captain Fesmeyer, had, like the others, been called to the front by Lieutenant Colonel McDade. Subsequently, many people pointed to this as a major error, and in light of what has happened, it was. The firing began to roll on all around us. The executive officer of my company, a man called Don Cornett, a very fine officer, jumped up and in the best style of the infantry school yelled, "Follow me." Elements of our 1st and 2nd platoons ran right towards a series of anthills. Within 10 feet of them, we saw where the machine gunners behind them firing point blank at us. Men all around me began to fall like mown grass. I had never seen people killed before. They began to drop like flies and die right in front of me. These were the only friends I had, and they were dying all around me. Private First Class James H. Shadden was in Thorpe's Delta Company mortar platoon. The intensity of the fire increased to the point where Shadden couldn't hear anything but weapons firing. And here's what he says. Tone Johnson came crawling with me, hitting the cheek and the back of the hand. The trees were full of North Vietnamese, but spotting one was almost impossible. They blended in so well. I kept raising up to try and detect a good target. Matthew Shelton, who was laying next to me, kept jerking me down. As I raised up again, a bullet pierced my helmet straight through, front to back. I went down again and came back, and as I came back up, a bullet struck the tree beside my head from behind. I don't know if we were surrounded or it was our own men. They were firing wild. Anything that moved, somebody shot at it. One trooper crawled up next to me, shooting through the grass a few inches off the ground toward where our own people lay, never thinking what he was doing. I told him to be sure he knew what he was shooting at. The firing eventually began to slack off. Shadden has no idea how much time elapsed. There was no way to keep track of time in a fight like this. Men were wounded and dead, all in the area. 6 were alive that I know of. Sergeant Tyler, PFC Carter, PFC Johnson, PFC Shelton, PFC Cones, and myself. Tyler gave the only order I heard during the entire fight. Try to pull back before they finish us off. Shelton froze to the ground and would not move. The 5 of us proceeded to try and pull back, but the snipers were still in the trees. Soon I was hit in the right shoulder, which for a time rendered it useless. Tyler was hit in the neck about the same time. He died an arm's length from me, begging for the medic, Spec 4 William Pleasant, who was already dead. The last words Tyler ever spoke were, "I'm dying." Sergeant Tyler, 35, was from Columbia, South Carolina. The helplessness I felt is beyond description. Within a few minutes, I was hit again in the left knee. The pain was unbearable. Cones was hit in the feet and ankle. We were wounded and trapped. I could see we were getting wiped out. A buddy helped me bandage my leg. He got the bandage off a dead Vietnamese. I got behind a log, and there was a Vietnamese there, busted up and dead. This was behind us, so I knew we were surrounded. For me, it's crazy to think these are Americans. It really is. You know, it's crazy to think. You always think, naively so, that Americans have the upper hand all the time, but you know, here you are. You don't. You don't always have the upper hand.